And because we encountered buried soils under waterlogged, buried landscapes over great acreages, I decided very much to go into the paleoenvironmental side of archaeology, and particularly looking at ancient soils and the fingerprints that are within those soils that give the game away to both human activities, natural events, and all sorts of processes. And after 20 years nearly in the field, I was lucky enough to get a job at Archaeology, where I've now been for 20 years, and continue to have a really thriving soil science micromorphology lab, of which there's some products of that lab, in fact, in the room. And we're involved in a variety of landscape projects around the world, but also looking at what I call, if you like, archaeology of context, sort of microstratigraphic analysis, which backs up a lot of very detailed urban-type excavations, again, in various parts of the world. But today I'm not going to talk about that sort of thing. What I really want to talk about is, in essence, seeing the sort of expanding role of geoarchaeology as an umbrella of which a lot of paleoenvironmental studies fall, and indeed in which landscape modeling falls. And also one that where we need to think that what we're doing is not just applicable to thinking about past environmental dynamics and sequencing of how landscapes change over time and human impact on those, but partly driven, I'm afraid, by the UK government having to justify ourselves to a wider public. And by that I mean saying, you know, what were our findings? Do they actually have a relevance to modern society? Can we actually influence how land is used today? And indeed, how farming practice might be constrained. And what I'm going to do is look just very briefly at two incomplete case studies, one in northern Ethiopia, which I've done with my colleague, Dr. Federica Soulas, who's now at the University of Pretoria, under the auspices of Rodolfo Fatovic at Napoli. And in the other project with one of my Cambridge colleagues is in the northwestern corner of India, in Haryana and eastern Rajasthan provinces, which hopefully a direct comparison, in fact, to the Gujarat case study, where we're working with a collaborative Indian-UK team run by Dr. Cameron Petrie from my own department and Ravinder Singh from Varanasi in India itself. And the reason I've chosen these two is because they illustrate, I hope, these problems of scale where you have big questions, a massive landscape, but yet within those massive landscapes we can often really begin to drill down into, if you like, the finest scale from an individual soil and work our way up to a broader schematic, if you like, as to what might be happening in relation to an archaeological problem which concerns a big region. And then hopefully at the end of that, I then sort of say, well, what we need to do, and then think a little bit about some of the really simplistic models that I've been involved with helping to create in the past, and then think about, well, what do we need to do to actually address some of the things that I was commenting on earlier about making the sort of technological side of modeling actually applicable to real live archaeological problems, so we can actually hopefully begin to make an impact with that technical side and become part of the broader suite, I hope, of archaeological or routine archaeological methodologies, I hope. So turning to the Axum area of northwestern Ethiopia, was a natural progression for me. I worked with Tony Wilkinson just across the sea here in highland Yemen in the early 90s, before access, if you like, was stopped. And there with Tony Wilkinson, we had a massive program of reconnaissance on the ground, which showed that there was a massive explosion in population in the Neolithic Bronze Age, which led to huge amounts of hill wash in the system. High ground on Bietigoras itself, the high ground, and indeed Marco was with us for this very early field work with Federica and myself. The sort of eroding slopes, which are now largely terraced, and then a varying size but small set of floodplains. And we are very much looking from the buried soil perspective, the erosion complex, that kind of thing. And essentially Federica, on the basis of her postgraduate work, has suggested there's sort of three phases of development in this landscape. So particularly on the hilltops, which aren't very high, 200 meters above the existing floodplain, there are really, really thick, I'm going to have to go through these, vertisols, that can be anything up to sort of 2.5 meters. These are highly resilient soils in terms of moisture retention. They're fine grained, silt and clay and so on, as you can see in this photomicrograph just here. And it seems that these soils are certainly in existence by the mid-Holocene. They can be very thick, but by the time you get to the slopes themselves, it's a complete erosion complex. And it looks like that none of those soils, and here you can see an old age horizon buried by hill wash, are of any great antiquity. They're most sort of 1,500 to 2,000 years old at best. So if you like, that earlier landscape has been almost on the slopes completely obliterated as far as one can tell. Okay? Yet at the same time, the paleoenvironmental data, pollen data and phytoliths in particular, are suggesting that it's an open woody savanna that doesn't have a huge human impact in terms of exploitation going on within it. So what's perhaps driving that real change? Okay? And then when you get into on the margins of these hilltops, so this is yes, glorious up the top. You get these slopes of these are largely 1960 plus age vintage of terraces, which obviously failed. Imposition by Haile Selassie, the emperor, decided to cultivate this landscape, no longer used, you can see. But just on the margins often of this hilltop, you get damming systems, small irrigation systems, which seem to be from about the 4th or 5th century AD. So if you like, the final flowering, if you like, of the royal city of Axum. And at the same time, coincidentally, from rainfall and pollen data work by Henry Lamb and colleagues elsewhere in the region, it suggests that these dams are coincident when, if you like, there's a slightly wetter period, which is actually coming to its end. And I wonder whether these dams are like the last gasp attempt to try and retain moisture on that hilltop area, which have these fantastic soils with high growth potential, fertility growth. And then when you get into the actual floodplains themselves, often there's very, very little in the way of sediment catchment forming these inset terraces. And where you do find them occasionally, like in this layer stack here where it's slightly thicker, in this particular river valley to the northeast of Axum, you find that probably half of that profile is later, is equivalent, if you like, the Axum floret of use in the early 1st century AD. But the vast bulk of that profile is post-16th century. So essentially, that's probably where our hillside slope material has ended up, in certain places caught. But the vast bulk of it has been swept out, I think, much further downstream. So you need to think, we haven't got this sort of dramatic impact with climate change. What we've probably got is a series of punctuations where there's disequilibrium in the system, where there's certainly human activity, but human activity can't really be seen as the major driver, in my view, in terms of that particular soil data. So what Federica then decided to do was have a very, very long and hard look at the ethnographic and historical data for the region. And we're blessed this was on a sort of a, if you like, the equivalent of the gentleman's 17th, 18th, 19th century gentleman's royal tour, as it were, of Africa. So there are lots of really, really good accounts of Axum, its water system, the crops they're growing, how they're actually retaining water, the variety of crops they're using, what tools they're using, and so on, which enables us, if you like, to get to a better appreciation that they aren't just blitzkrieging the landscape. They aren't being totally uncaring about soil conservation. They're actually retaining moisture as well as they can. They're using crops which, like teff, which are able to actually be grown in very semi-arid conditions where rainfall is often not the best in terms of consistency. So, you know, we're seeing something where there's actually sympathetic landscape use in the long term. And I think that probably goes with that drip, if you like, that slow alluvial aggradation, much of which is quite recent. And these are just some of the water storage areas today. Here's one from today, and then these still exist. They're probably a couple hundred years old, these cisterns on the top, and they still do retain seasonally procured water from the sky as well as from the ground surface, groundwater table themselves. Okay. But This is probably the most telling set of photographs that I've perhaps seen in my work, really, which chart just the northern part of Africa. So this is Vietigoris on the top, those dams and so on, those ruined terraces are all on this side. The modern city, Christian city, is here in the foreground. If you think about scales of resolution of our paleoenvironmental data, and indeed even our soils data, and indeed our archaeological data, you can see essentially here, you've got a sort of a very wasted landscape just over 100 years ago, the beginning of scrub development, where there's no agricultural use, and now almost partly, three-quarters wooded. That does not show up at all in the modern pollen diagrams at all, okay, in the sense of being, you can't see that progression of change, and it's beyond the dated resolution if you think of most radiocarbon, or at the resolution of it. So, the implications for that to me are quite strong. And of course, in terms of soil development, this type of woodland would hardly change the microscopic signatures in the soil. I mean, normally if you have a woodland soil, it's very easy to identify. If it's an old woodland soil, and you can identify erosion within it, you're going to identify clearance from it. But something that is that short-lived in soil formation terms, you'd be unlikely to ever see. And so, you're looking potentially there at 2 or 3 generations of archaeological time. And in a disused landscape, would we ever really spot that? And I guess that's a sort of salutary thing, and it's probably something that the modelers could actually use. They could probably have that, they could discriminate out that type of different land use, if you like, and that growth of woodland within a mathematical model on that particular hill slope. But we probably couldn't find the archaeological data and the paleoenvironmental data that would really match it to show that progression of change. And I guess it's worrying, both worrying and a challenge. I guess. And then just look at this as a final shot for Axum. On the right, this is the Hibai quota, so those deep, thick alluvial profiles are just here. On the right, you have a well-managed farming landscape. They're adding nutrients to the soil. They have these lovely dark topsoils. They're plowing across the hillside. There's these new, quite larger field system boundaries. There's no erosion in the system. Look at the other side. No management for the last 5 years. It's a waste. It's a semi-desert wasteland. And again, if you had the pollen data from in here, would you actually spot the difference between these two contemporary landscapes, which are treated in a very different way with distinct human impact? Again, I think it's probably beyond the scale of our resolution, at least of most paleoenvironmental data. And so this has now led, particularly myself, working, say, in places like Terra del Fuego with Rob Scaife, a pollen analyst, who's somebody I've worked with for years in the East Anglian Fens, where we no longer would ever trust one pollen diagram on its own. What we'd want is a transect series of pollen diagrams at very short spatial intervals with very, very large amounts of counts, lots of AMS dating from many points in the sequence to actually get sufficient, possibly sufficient resolution to actually think about that very divergent landscape use in a very close spatial proximity through time. And I think you'll only find archaeological pollen analysts, beginning to think that way and not just going for the deepest, best sequence in the deepest peat bog they can find to get a sub-regional picture. It's no good for looking at human impact, in my view, or not good enough, insufficient these days. Okay. So swapping to northwestern India, Cameron Petrie was very keen that, if you like, people talk an awful lot about the beginnings of the Harappan settlement on a grand scale in Haryana province, so in roughly Delhi, sort of here somewhere. This sort of patch just outside, because for obvious reasons we can't go into Pakistan, where the type sites are, and also the demise of this system at some point within the sort of earlier second millennium BC, or apparent demise. And you'll find in the literature there's much information or speculation that there's this huge earlier river system called the Sarasvati, now more or less on the line of the Gagar floodplain of today, which has been associated, there's a huge literature, and Mark will probably testify to this, from Indian scholars, both historians, hydrologists, and archaeologists, that it's the demise of that river system that leads to the demise of this early tell-type settlement landscape of Harappa. And lo and behold, that's not the case as far as we can see so far. So what Cameron decided to do, these are the corona images spliced together. You know, it's a massive landscape, as most of you know, to pick 3 or 4 major areas to actually concentrate in terms of new field work. And it's really simple. You know, are these sites, all these type sites, Gunawali and Irwani and so on, are they sitting on islands in a floodplain system? Is there an existing river system next to them? Are they in a natural alluvial type floodplain system? How are they functioning? How is their agricultural base functioning? And the first thing that was done was our Indian colleagues out towards Kalabangan, one of the main type sites. And of course, we couldn't dig any of the big type sites to get permissions to dig. We had to dig smaller sites, but there they got permission to do a huge radar, GPR radar survey across the supposed earlier big river system. And it's big, you know, it's about 250 meters across, it's about 15 meters deep. And they did sedimentology top to bottom. This is by another colleague, Ranjiv Sinha from Kunar Technical College. And all the infilling sediments are derived from the Himalayas, so off in our northeastern corner, hundreds of miles away. And the OSL dating, as much as one you might think could trust OSL, suggests that that infilling process is more or less complete by 14,000 BP. So that sort of initially at a stroke, potentially, you could say that some parts of that major river system no longer exist. It isn't the main initial Harappan civilization, possibly. But obviously, it's clear to anyone, you can see these huge dendritic systems that still exist. What role do they play in this former enormous floodplain? Well, when you start to look at the sites themselves, essentially you have an apparently alluvial floodplain that creeps up and overlaps with the sites. This is Masadpur in the middle sort of part of this landscape. And there's 7 or 8 tell sites in very close proximity at this particular example. And when you start to look, it's a bit bright here, but just take my word for it, that once you get beneath the archaeological levels, there's about 4 meters of alluvium in this particular patch. Maybe we can just get out a bit better, see a little bit better. And this happened time and time again. And often at the very bottom of these, you hit essentially sand levees, so part of this earlier river system. And often on those sand levees, but beneath the archaeological levels, are these lovely organic soils. These are man-made soils. These are alluvial soils that have been enriched with loads and loads of organic matter. And it's got to be through human management. And obviously, then in this case, covered by Harappan settlement. So it suggests we're already dealing with a highly managed landscape and one that's an alluvial system. But there are virtually, as far as we can tell, the river system is a series of seasonal creeks. It's not one big river that's meandering through the system. It's a series of those dendritic creeks which are seasonally fed by monsoonal rain system, or a monsoonal rain system. And of course today, that alluvial flooding, so just like the Nile of today post Aswan Dam, all this lovely enriched soil sediment that's coming from the northeast is now completely constrained within these artificial imbounded canalized systems. It doesn't spread out onto the landscape. And so that alluvial landscape, even though it's the breadbasket of India, to me is losing its fertility. It's particulate, it's coarse silt and fine sand. It doesn't retain moisture, it doesn't retain organics unless you add stuff to it, okay? So it's potentially a system, if you like, it's not very sustainable long term if you want it to be your grain basket. And of course, many of the sites, like this is next to that other Masadpur site, is about 200 meters this way. This is another one. They're being destroyed regularly. time and time again, pouring of these silts for mud brick manufacture today. And you can see just beginning to see one of these levees, sand levees, and the creek next to it, another levee, showing up where they've stripped off a couple meters of the alluvial floodplain. So in a sense, we have a version of the fenlands of East Anglia. We have these huge river systems emptying into a massive estuarine basin, which are all buried. And the archaeology is part buried, and the old landscapes are part buried. So obviously, logistically, it's extremely difficult to actually get at. And then just the other sort of icing on the cake problem, which is probably worse, every, well, 100 meters at least, corner of every field in this landscape today, they're digging these well sleeves down to the modern groundwater table. And anecdotally, when you talk to these well diggers, 10 years ago, the groundwater table was at about 10 meters below the ground surface. Now it's 30 to 50 meters below the ground surface. And there's a brackish water zone in between. So to me, it doesn't matter how much you pump, the aquifer is going to run dry, like so many places. And of course, at some point, it's going to become brackish. They're going to have that water on the top. It's going to kill the roots. And from that replenishment from underneath, because there's no alluviation anymore to replenish the fertile organic aspect of soil with new soil every year, and with this water being potentially becoming of a poor grade, there's no way, I don't think, that this landscape can last full time unless another alternative way of managing agriculturally is devised. And just like what Andrea was saying about getting that fantastic lot of rainfall data for Gujarat, I haven't got a slide of it, but Cameron Petrie and David Redhouse, my two colleagues, have now got that same sort of data over the last sort of 150 years. And it's showing, if you like, just like in England where we have a punctuated alluvial system, which is a natural flood-borne type of environment, we're missing the benefit of all of that in this highly structured modern landscape. But it looks like to me that potentially in Harappan times, they had this naturally replenished landscape, which they were artificially enhancing, maybe not controlling the way we would with ditches and irrigation systems to contain it, but certainly able to capture it enough to use it to be sustainable from the agricultural point of view to actually run these sites. So this is just typical. That's all alluvial, cut through the alluvium. The water is just channeled straight through and out. So where do we start with a lot of these things? What other types of data sets do we need, or what sort of collections of data sets do we need to really begin to think about these landscapes and actually get enough, to me, really detailed information to actually be able to think about landscape change over time, where you're pretty sure that that's what's happening, with enough paleoenvironmental parameters to be even more sure, and to be able to add, if you like, in the archaeological dimension to think, well, can we actually relate archaeological events in terms of settlement pattern through to events that we might see within the paleoenvironmental record? And if you like, it's that suite of things, both that, which we were practicing, particularly at Axum, which we need to actually utilize, and obviously that new climatic data, and that's really, I think, where the modeling comes in from my perspective as an amateur in terms of that sort of thing. It's the only way we can actually project backwards into time as to what might be the possibilities, the realm of possibilities for the moisture rainfall system, which might have a direct bearing on the nature of the soils and the nature of the agricultural soils you're actually dealing with. Now, of course, when I said, in my comments a few minutes ago, in our plenary discussion, was that just now to look a little bit at simplistic models, a lot of archaeologists want to see a picture, okay? It might be not something that you particularly want to, see as a great design, but they want to be able to see, I think, landscape data transformed into something they can see or fly through. And this is the only thing this is something from, I was involved in southwestern United States and New Mexico. This is just modeling the pollen data for the Pueblo period in central New Mexico and the Rio del Oso Valley. But I don't have the video with me, but Vince Gaffney's done a similar fly through the possible prehistoric landscape of Stonehenge, for example. Those are the kind of things which I know are, for public consumption, but sometimes we need these things to persuade a wider public of the value of what we are actually doing. But more often than not, it's this hypothesis-driven type of work. So this is work in northern central Sicily with John Ayala, now a lecturer at Sheffield, again one of my former PhD students, where we're looking at the impact of Roman farmsteads on a sort of high, hilly landscape using the universal soil loss equation. Incredibly simple, really just looking at slope, vegetation, and rainfall. And if you compare that subsistence imprint, if you like, through to more pastoralist type input, you can actually see this potential in the valley system itself to pick up hill wash type deposits, which indeed we did. But of course, in terms of our work, this is all published in Geoarchaeology, I think in 2005, where, if you like, the resolution of our data looking at our erosion sequences in the valley only showed 4 interruptions of disruption, agricultural disruption leading to hill wash in this valley system. And of course, when it comes to the modeling, the only way we could get an idea of the impact of these Roman settlements was through historical data from Strabo, suggesting what the sort of diameter, if you like, of use was of a particular Roman farmstead. But at that really simple level, immediately it allows you to actually think about formulating your research as an archaeologist. So where am I actually going to find the products of erosion? Where am I going to actually find the potential pre-Roman buried land surfaces? And a form of visually testing, if you like, what might be some possible scenarios, but they are only possible, as we talked about earlier today. And then something that developed out of my work at Cromwell and Chase is southern England and chalk downlands, where you have big Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments upstanding in the landscape. I could do a whole lecture just on one of these particular things, but just to pull out a salient point where it's Edgar Samarasundra, somebody from Imperial College, research student there, who good friend of Mark Lake's, who we engaged to actually look at a particular set of data in southern England. And here we have today, it's our grain basket of southern England, highly agricultural landscape, huge intensive early prehistoric agricultural record, prehistoric record, in terms of both settlement and ceremonial and burial type monuments. And you could compare this Cranbourne Chase landscape to what's around Stonehenge and Durrington Walls, where I've done similar things to this. And what Edgar did was actually use a combination of ecological succession modeling and behavioral modeling of livestock activity. And the reason for doing that was we want, in terms of the pollen data, which we've got really fantastic sets of data, if you like, in close proximity. This is a kilometre square, okay, of this particular landscape. We have dug 25 of these sites. We have 25 sets of buried soils. We have the molluscan data from all those sites. We have 3 pollen diagrams. We have really good radiocarbon dating. So just that kilometre square, we decide what would it take to make that landscape so open as it is now, and apparently was so open in the 3rd millennium, so the later Neolithic of southern England. And he suggested, that given the degree of openness derived from the pollen data, which here, so the paler colours being open, or sorry, the other way around, the darker colours being open, that you needed large amounts of livestock in that landscape to actually keep it open. And there's also new thinking, I guess, in British Neolithic, re-examining the impact of farming and so on, which perhaps is lending itself to similar conclusions. If there's that many livestock to keep it open, and a pastoral system, which it definitely is from the soils data, over the long term, over at least a millennia and a half, you probably need many, many more people in that landscape to actually keep it that open, to actually manage and utilize that pastoral landscape, pastoral sort of agricultural system. And indeed, now at Stonehenge and Durrington, we've done exactly the same thing with Mike Parker Pearson and a big project there, where we now have, again, a very similar, very open early landscape, which seems to be already completely open by the time you get the construction of the first monuments at Stonehenge and Durrington Walls around 2900, 3000 BC. So it presupposes that there may well be much greater impact in earlier prehistoric times, perhaps later Mesolithic, early Neolithic times in this landscape, which are actually predisposing this landscape to keeping it as it is and open. But again, a bit like those soils in India, they're almost all sands. They're sandy loams with no organic component. They'll blow in the wind just like that. They're incredibly fine-grained. They don't produce good thick soils, so they're not great for agriculture. And I think people would have soon discovered, once they cleared them, that they were very unsustainable in terms of agricultural cropping regimes. And that's why they became a pastoral environment, and that's possibly why these landscapes become these huge ceremonial and settlement complexes in the later Neolithic. But again, these are only just little pinpricks. You know, it's a small landscape, if you like, in southern England as opposed to the Harappan area of northwestern India. But it's the sort of thing I feel we, you know, with really simple methodology, we can use quite a tight site of soils, palynological and archaeological data to model over and over again in certain parts of the world where the archaeological data is very rich, which might lend itself, if you like, to getting better interpretations, or at least augmenting or giving possible other interpretations of what might be possible. And I think I'll stop there. I hope that's given a sort of, I hope we're, you know, a practical application which you can see can be used by archaeologists, and by talking to people like yourselves to actually enhance that modeling, make it better, we might actually get somewhere in terms of thinking about hypothesis-led and suggestions and possible answers, which might go partly to explaining some of the archaeological database. Thank you very much.